For 483 years, we called him a liar. Gaspar de Carvajal was a Dominican friar who traveled with Francisco de Orellana down the Amazon River in 1542. He kept a journal. In it, he described something that seemed impossible. Cities so large and so densely populated along the river banks that a pin dropped from the sky would land on someone's head. He wrote of roads, of plazas, of settlements that stretched for miles without interruption. He described a landscape that was not wild but cultivated, managed, organized. European scholars read his account and dismissed it. The Amazon, they believed, was a green hell, a place where civilization could not take root. The soil was too poor, the jungle too hostile, diseases too relentless. If great cities had once existed there, where were the stones? Where were the monuments? Where was the evidence? Carvajal died in 1584, his reputation in ruins. His journal gathered dust in archives. The Amazon became, in the Western imagination, a symbol of nature untouched by human hands, a wilderness, a void. Then, in the early 21st century, we turned lasers on the jungle canopy, and Carvajal stopped being a liar. What we found beneath the trees was not stone, it was earth. Not monuments, but platforms. It's not cities in the Roman sense, but something else entirely, something we are only now beginning to understand. A form of urbanism so fundamentally different from our expectations that it took us 5 centuries to recognize it for what it was. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, Echoes of Forgotten Lore. This is the story of how LiDAR technology revealed the largest network of pre-Columbian settlements ever discovered in the Amazon basin. How millions of laser pulses pierced through rainforest canopy to expose a civilization that built not up but out, not with stone but with soil. And how the very trees that hid this world from us may themselves be the descendants of the gardens these ancient peoples planted. This is the story of garden urbanism. The Upano Valley sits on the eastern slopes of the Ecuadorian Andes, where the mountains descend into the Amazon basin. It is a transitional zone, neither fully highland nor lowland, but something in between. The valley floor is cut by rivers. The canopy is thick. For centuries, farmers here knew that if they dug deep enough, they would hit platforms. Artificial terraces made of earth. Local knowledge held that these were old. Maybe Inca, maybe older. In 2015, a French archaeologist named Stéphen Rostain decided to look closer. Rostain had spent decades working in Amazonian archaeology, much of it focused on agricultural earthworks. He knew that the Amazon was not, and had never been, an untouched wilderness. Indigenous peoples had been shaping this landscape for millennia. They had built raised fields for farming. They had created terra preta, Amazonian dark earth, by mixing charcoal and organic waste into the soil to make it fertile. They had managed forests, cultivating useful species and discouraging others. But what Rostain suspected existed in the Upano Valley was something different in scale. He arranged for LiDAR surveys of the region. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. It is, in essence, digital deforestation. An airplane or drone flies over the jungle carrying a laser scanner. The scanner emits millions of pulses per second. Each pulse is a beam of light that travels down through the canopy. Most of these pulses hit leaves and branches and bounce back. But some, a small percentage, slip through gaps in the foliage and strike the ground. When they do, they return information about the shape of the earth beneath the trees. A computer processes these returns, filtering out the vegetation. What remains is a three-dimensional model of the bare Earth's surface, hills, valleys, and, critically, anything humans built. When Rostain's team processed the LiDAR data from the Upano Valley, they found platforms. Thousands of them, not scattered randomly, but arranged, connected by roads, organized into clusters. The platforms were rectangular, elevated several meters above the surrounding terrain. Each one measured roughly 20 meters by 10 meters. Some were larger. They were surrounded by drainage ditches and agricultural channels. The roads between them were sunken, carved into the earth, some of them stretching for 10 or even 20 kilometers. The team identified at least 15 distinct settlement complexes. Within these complexes, they counted more than 6,000 individual platforms. The settlements were arranged in a rough grid. The largest of them covered an area of approximately 150 square kilometers. Carbon dating of excavated material suggested that construction began around 500 BCE and continued for at least 1,000 years, possibly longer. People who built this network are believed to be the ancestors of the modern Shuar people, speakers of the Ants Chichim language family. When the findings were published in Science magazine in January 2024, the headlines called it a lost city, the largest and oldest urban center ever found in the Amazon. But that framing, while dramatic, misses the point, because this was not a city, not in the way we use that word. When we think of ancient cities, we think of density, concentration. We think of Uruk, of Teotihuacan, of Rome. We think of stone temples rising above plazas, of walls encircling populations measured in the tens of thousands. We think of specialization, priests, merchants, artisans, soldiers. We think of hierarchy made visible in architecture. The Upano Valley does not fit this model. There are no temples here, no palaces, no fortifications. The platforms are uniform in size and construction. They do not suggest a class of elites living apart from commoners. The roads do not lead to a central monument. There is no obvious ceremonial core. What the Upano Valley represents is something archaeologists are calling low-density urbanism, or more evocatively, garden urbanism. The idea is this: instead of concentrating people into a dense core, the Ants Chichim people spread out across the landscape in a planned network of residential platforms, each surrounded by managed agricultural land. The platforms served as bases for houses, likely built from wood and thatch. The spaces between platforms were not empty. They were gardens, orchards, fields of manioc and maize, fish ponds, groves of palms. This was not subsistence farming in the sense of individual families scratching out survival. This was landscape-scale agriculture, coordinated across thousands of households. The road network suggests movement, trade, communication. The drainage systems suggest engineering expertise. The sheer extent of the settlement suggests a population in the tens of thousands, possibly more. But it looked nothing like what we expect a city to look like. And that is why it remained invisible for so long, because European colonizers and the scholars who followed them were looking for stone, concentration. For the markers of urbanism as defined by Mediterranean and Mesopotamian templates, the Amazon offered none of these things. So they concluded that civilization had not happened here. They were wrong. Civilization had happened. It just looked different. The Upano Valley is not unique. In 2022, archaeologist Heiko Prumers published LiDAR data from the Llanos de Mojos in Bolivia, a vast floodplain in the southwestern Amazon. His team identified a network of settlements built by the Casseret culture between 500 and 1400 CE. These settlements were also organized around earthen platforms, causeways, and water management systems. The largest site, called Kotoka, covered more than 500 hectares and included monumental platform mounds, reservoirs, and a road network connecting it to smaller satellite settlements. The Llanos de Mojos sites are different from the Upano Valley in their inclusion of larger ceremonial structures, suggesting a different social organization. But the underlying principle is the same: low-density urbanism, integrated with intensive agriculture. Further LiDAR surveys conducted across the Amazon basin in 2023 and 2024 have revealed hundreds of additional sites. In Brazil's Acre State, researchers found geometric earthworks called geoglyphs. Massive ditches arranged in squares and circles, some of them dating back more than 2,000 years. In the Santarém region, along the lower Amazon, LiDAR revealed dense networks of settlement mounds and fish weirs. Each new dataset reinforces the same conclusion. The Amazon was not a wilderness, it was a garden. And in 2025, researchers at the University of Amsterdam provided the most striking evidence yet, that this garden has never entirely disappeared. The study, led by Dr. Carolina Levis and published in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, used a combination of LiDAR data, satellite imagery, and on-the-ground surveys to map the distribution of tree species across the Amazon basin. The team focused on species known to have economic value for indigenous peoples: Brazil nut, cacao, rubber trees, palms. What they found was that these species do not distribute randomly, they cluster. Specifically, they cluster around the locations of ancient earthworks. The team analyzed more than 10,000 archaeological sites identified through LiDAR, at sites with evidence of pre-Columbian occupation. The concentration of domesticated tree species was up to 5 times higher than in surrounding forest. The effect was strongest at the largest and oldest sites, suggesting that centuries of cultivation had fundamentally altered the composition of the forest. Even more remarkably, the team estimated that between 10,000 and 24,000 earthworks still exist in the Amazon, most of them still hidden beneath the canopy. These are not ruins in the conventional sense. They are living landscapes. The trees growing on them today are the descendants of trees planted by people who lived here 1,000 years ago. This has profound implications for how we understand both the past and the future of the Amazon. For the past, it means that what we have been calling virgin rainforest is, in many places, a cultural landscape, a forest shaped by human hands over millennia. The species composition, the soil chemistry, even the topography in many areas, are products of indigenous land management. For the future, it means that conservation strategies that assume the Amazon is a wilderness to be protected from human interference are based on a false premise. The Amazon has always been inhabited. It has always been managed. And the indigenous peoples who live there today are not threats to the forest. They are its cultivators, its designers. The laser did not just reveal lost cities, it revealed a lost philosophy of living. Let us return to the technology for a moment, because understanding what LiDAR can and cannot do is essential to understanding what we are actually seeing here. LiDAR penetrates the canopy, but it does not see everything. It reveals topography. It shows us the shape of the earth. But it cannot tell us what materials were used to build structures. It cannot show us organic remains. It cannot date anything. What this means is that LiDAR is a prospecting tool, not a final answer. It tells us where to dig. It allows archaeologists to identify sites that would be impossible to find on foot. But the real work, the excavation, the analysis, the radiocarbon dating, still has to happen the old-fashioned way. And there is still so much we do not know. We do not know, for example, how these societies were organized politically. The absence of obvious monumental architecture in places like the Upano Valley suggests that power was not centralized in the way it was in, say, the Maya city-states. But that does not mean these societies lacked organization, the road networks, the coordinated drainage systems. The sheer scale of earthwork construction all point to planning and cooperation on a massive scale. We do not know exactly what these people ate, though we can make educated guesses based on archaeobotanical remains, armaic, maize, squash, beans, fish, game, tree fruits. But the specifics, the balance of cultivated versus wild foods, the seasonal rhythms of diet, all of this remains unclear. We do not know what happened to them, because by the time European colonizers arrived in the 16th century, these large settlements were largely abandoned. The population of the Amazon basin had collapsed. Some scholars estimate that up to 90% of the indigenous population died in the century following contact. Victims of smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases introduced by Europeans. The survivors dispersed into smaller communities, many of them in the deep forest. Away from the rivers where European slavers and missionaries operated, the roads were swallowed by jungle, the platforms became hills covered in trees. The knowledge of how to build and maintain these systems was lost, or at least went underground, preserved only in fragments. Gaspar de Carvajal saw these settlements at the peak of their existence. By the time the next wave of European explorers arrived a century later, they were gone. And so the later explorers concluded that Carvajal had been lying or exaggerating. They could not imagine that an entire civilization could vanish so quickly. But it did. And this is the tragedy embedded in the LiDAR data. Every platform, every road, every earthwork is evidence not just of what was built, but of what was destroyed. Let us talk about what garden urbanism actually means as a way of living. Imagine you are a member of an ants Chichim community in the Upano Valley. Around the year 500 CE, your house sits on a rectangular platform, raised above the flood zone. The platform is made of earth excavated from the surrounding ditches. It is compacted, stable. Your house is built from hardwood posts and thatch. It is cool inside, even in the midday heat. Around your platform, within a few minutes' walk, are the gardens. Manioc grows in mounds, maize in rows. There are fruit trees, guava, cacao palms. There are medicinal plants, or plants used for dyes, for fibers, for construction materials. The forest and the garden blend into each other without a clear boundary. You know which trees are wild and which were planted by your grandparents. You know which vines are useful and which are poisonous. Water management is critical. The ditches around your platform drain excess water during the rainy season, preventing your crops from being waterlogged. During the dry season, they retain moisture. Fish live in the ditches. You harvest them with woven traps. A road runs past your platform, sunken into the earth to keep it from washing away. It connects you to other platforms, to other families. You travel this road to visit relatives, to trade, to participate in communal labor projects. Maybe you are helping to extend a road. Maybe you are helping to build a new platform for a young couple starting a household. There is no king here, no priest living in a stone temple. But there is order. There are rules about land use, about water rights, about who contributes labor to communal projects. These rules are enforced by consensus, by reputation, by the knowledge that your survival depends on cooperation with your neighbors. This is not primitive, it's sophisticated. It is urbanism designed for a specific environment. An environment where stone is scarce, where the soil can be made fertile with the right management, where water is abundant but must be controlled. An environment where density is not an advantage, because concentrating too many people in one place would exhaust local resources. An environment where spreading out, integrating living space with agricultural space, makes sense. This is engineering adapted to rainforest ecology, and it worked for over 1,000 years. The archaeological community is still wrestling with the implications of these discoveries. For decades, the dominant narrative in Amazonian archaeology was that the rainforest could not support large populations. The soil was too poor, the protein sources too dispersed, the carrying capacity too low. This narrative was based partly on observation of modern indigenous groups, most of whom live in small villages of a few dozen to a few hundred people. But we now know that these modern groups are not living in the same way their ancestors did. They are living in the aftermath of a demographic catastrophe. Their small population sizes, their mobility, their avoidance of the major rivers. All of this is a survival strategy developed in response to colonization. Before contact, the Amazon was home to millions of people. They had developed agricultural systems capable of supporting dense populations. They had transformed the landscape on a continental scale, and they did it without causing ecological collapse. This is perhaps the most important lesson of garden urbanism. Because modern industrial agriculture is predicated on the idea that high yields require the destruction of natural ecosystems. You clear the forest. You plant monocultures. You apply synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. You irrigate. You mechanize. You extract. The Ants Chichen people and their contemporaries across the Amazon took a different approach. They worked with the forest, not against it. They enriched the soil rather than depleting it. They cultivated diversity rather than monoculture. They built systems that were productive and sustainable over centuries. We tend to assume that sustainability and productivity are in tension, that you can have one or the other, but not both. The archaeological record of the Amazon suggests this is false. It is possible to feed large populations without destroying the environment. But it requires a fundamentally different relationship with the land. It requires seeing the landscape not as a resource to be exploited, but as a partner to be cultivated. There is a risk in telling this story of romanticization. It would be easy to turn the ancient Amazonians into ecological saints, people who lived in perfect harmony with nature. This would be just as misleading as the older narrative that painted them as isolated. Bands of hunter-gatherers barely eking out an existence. The people who built the Upano Valley settlements were not living in harmony with nature. They were manipulating nature on an enormous scale. They were moving millions of cubic meters of earth. They were redirecting water flow. They were deciding which species would thrive and which would not. This was domination, but of a particular kind. A kind that maintained the complexity of the ecosystem even as it bent that ecosystem toward human purposes. We should not idealize it, but we should learn from it, because the challenges these people faced, managing water, maintaining soil fertility, Feeding large populations in a tropical environment are challenges we are facing today, and the solutions they developed. Integrating agriculture with forestry, building soil health through organic inputs, designing infrastructure that works with natural hydrology rather than against it, are solutions we desperately need. The laser revealed the past, but it also revealed a possible future. Since the major LiDAR publications of 2024, funding for Amazonian archaeology has increased dramatically. Governments in Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru have commissioned new surveys. International teams are collaborating with indigenous communities to document sites and integrate traditional knowledge with scientific data. There are currently over 50 active LiDAR mapping projects in the Amazon basin. Each one reveals more platforms, more roads, more earthworks. The map of pre-Columbian Amazonia is being redrawn in real time. But there is also a race against time, because the same forests that hid these sites for centuries are being destroyed at an accelerating rate. Deforestation for cattle ranching, soy plantations, illegal logging, and mining is erasing the landscape before it can be studied. LiDAR can see through the canopy, but it cannot see through a clear-cut pasture. Once the forest is gone, the earthworks are vulnerable to erosion, to plowing, to looting. Some sites identified through LiDAR have been destroyed within months of their discovery. This is not just a loss for archaeology. It is a loss for humanity. Because these sites are not just evidence of the past, they are libraries. Each earthwork, each layer of soil, each scatter of pottery contains information about how people lived, how they adapted to their environment, how they organized themselves, what they believed. And once that information is gone, it is gone forever. Let me bring this back to Gaspar de Carvajal. When he traveled down the Amazon in 1542, he saw cities, saw populations so dense that a pin dropped from the sky would land on a head. He was not lying. He was not exaggerating. He was describing what was actually there. But the cities he saw were not made of stone, were made of earth, were not concentrated into a single urban core. They were spread across the landscape in a network of platforms and gardens. They did not look like Seville or Rome. They looked like nothing he had ever seen before. So when he tried to describe them, he used the only language he had, the language of European urbanism. He called them cities, compared their populations to those of European cities. He tried to fit what he was seeing into a framework his readers would understand. But the framework was inadequate, so his readers dismissed him. It has taken us nearly 500 years to develop a framework capable of recognizing what Carvajal saw. A framework that can accommodate urbanism without stone, civilization without monuments, agriculture without plows. The lasers gave us the data. But the real breakthrough was conceptual. It had to stop looking for what we expected to find and start seeing what was actually there. The story of the Amazon is not over. There are still millions of hectares of rainforest that have never been surveyed with LiDAR. There are still thousands of sites waiting to be discovered. There are still living indigenous communities who hold knowledge about these places. It's about how they were built, about what they meant. The platforms in the Upano Valley, the causeways in the Llanos de Mojos, the geoglyphs in Acre, all of these are pieces of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that, when complete, will show us a pre-Columbian Amazon far more populous, far more diverse, and far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. But more than that, it will show us a different way of being human in the tropics. A way that sustained millions of people for thousands of years without exhausting the land. A way that left behind not ruins, but gardens. Not deserts, but forests, enriched with the species people planted. The laser rewrote the Amazon. It turned a wilderness into a garden. It turned absence into presence. It turned silence into a story. And that story is still being written. Because the descendants of the people who built these platforms are still here. The Shuar, the Ants, the Achor, the Majano, the Kashiapua, and hundreds of other nations. They have survived 500 years of colonization, disease, displacement, and violence. They are still here. They are still managing the forest. They're still planting gardens. The platforms are ghost cities, yes. The knowledge is not dead. And if we are wise, if we listen, if we learn, we might yet rediscover what was lost. We might yet understand what Carvajal saw. A world where humans and forests were not enemies, but partners. where abundance did not require destruction, where civilization meant not conquest of the land but cultivation of it. The lasers showed us the bones of that world, hidden beneath the trees. Now we have to decide what to do with what we have found. The platforms of the Upano Valley and the living orchards of the Amazon remind us that we have never been separate from nature. We are its designers, we are its students. And for 5 centuries, we simply lacked the eyes to see the masterpiece right in front of us. Gaspar de Carvajal wasn't a liar. He was a witness to a way of life that prioritized the forest as much as the family. As we continue to peel back the layers of the living map with lasers and logic, we are finding more than just ruins. We are finding a blueprint for a future where we don't have to choose between civilization and the earth. If this descent into the green silence has echoed within you, I invite you to join our growing circle of observers. Subscribe to Whispered Chronicles Echoes of Forgotten Lore, and hit the notification bell so you can walk with us into the next forgotten chapter of our history. I'm curious to know, if a laser pierced the veil of your own history 1,000 years from now, what signature would you hope it finds? A ruin of stone, or a garden that still feeds the world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is the ink that keeps these stories from fading back into the trees. Thank you for listening to the Whispers of the Amazon with me. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.